a dialysis clinic plagued by a string of mysterious deaths.
They both went into cardiac arrest within 30 minutes of each other.
Employees at the facility were on edge, and patients were acutely aware that something was amiss, something was wrong.
Even under the changes in policy and procedure, the deaths still continued.
An investigation reveals evidence of an intentional crime.
There was a horrible smell that burned my eyes and my nostrils like bleach.
The police department took thousands of syringes.
The first thing we did was we identified that, yes, bleach was present in those syringes.
What it probably felt like to my mom was being burned from the inside out.
And when the killer is unmasked, it sends shockwaves through this small Texas town.
What was going on there? What was happening to these patients?
Why in little old Lufkin would there be a serial killer?
I don't know what's going on here, and it's just scary.
How could another human being do that to anybody?
For millions of Americans, dialysis treatments are a crucial part of their survival.
My mother had issues off and on the whole time we were growing up with diabetes, blood pressure, that type of things, which led to her having to go to dialysis. When she'd go to the doctor, I always went with her. I've always had that drawn to take care of another human being, and I've been a nurse for over 33 years. Dialysis treatment is that when you have some kidney malfunction or your kidneys aren't functioning as well as they should, and they actually pull your blood out and they clean it and then they put it back in. And it's a 3 to 4 hour process.
For 68-year-old Fran Metcalf, trips to the DaVita Clinic in Lufkin, Texas have become a regular part of her life.
The DaVita Dialysis Center in Lufkin is one of 2 large dialysis centers that take care of patients who've got kidney failure.
We were taking her to dialysis 3 days a week. I could go up and visit with her on Saturdays when I was off.
When Fran would come to dialysis, some real bonds were being made there, and she would tell us about the friendships that she had. I think it was a real personal experience because all of the people there receiving dialysis were really struggling to, maintain a good quality of life with all the obstacles that were in their way.
To both patients and staff, it's a routine process with relatively few complications. However, on April 1st, 2008, that isn't the case.
Fran was having a fairly normal treatment day that day, blood pressure normal, etc. And then all of a sudden she bottomed out.
Her blood pressure dropped drastically, and the alarms and the alerts were going off.
They call an ambulance. Luckily in Lufkin, it's small enough that the ambulance is less than 2 minutes away. Then they move to the hospital.
My dad had the nurse call me from the hospital. They just told me that she had cardiac arrest and there were some issues and I need to get there fast. When I get there, she had already passed. From my understanding, it is very rare for someone on dialysis to go into cardiac arrest. It was a big shock. I just really want to know why this happened.
Fran Metcalf was born on August 3, 1939 in Arkansas, and very quickly she faced serious health issues.
My mother had polio at a very young age, so she struggled with mobility and had to have braces on her legs.
As she got older and, her disability was affecting her a lot in school. Her education was not, great. She spent a lot of time in the hospital.
But there was a silver lining to Fran's illness. As a young woman, her treatments caused her to cross paths with her future husband.
Fran's aunt lived in Port Arthur, Texas, so her mom would bring her down to Port Arthur. There were bigger hospitals on the Gulf Coast.
She met my dad that was in the Coast Guard. They just hit it off. He was good looking, and mother fell head over heels in love. Mom and dad had dated probably about 6 months before they got married because he was headed back out and he wanted her to go with him. So it was a short engagement. She was there for my graduation. She was there, to bring me a cup of coffee at night when I was studying, just to make sure that I had everything that I needed.
As Fran entered middle age, she delighted in becoming a grandmother to 8 grandchildren.
She was wonderful at, planning parties and wanting to be at every event that the kids had. My youngest daughter's basketball games, the boys played baseball.
She was a very loving person. She just loved to be surrounded by people, listen to stories.
Unfortunately, Fran's health struggles continued. She was diagnosed with diabetes, and when her kidneys worsened, she was prescribed dialysis treatments. Fran became a regular patient at the Lufkin Clinic, where she found another kind of family.
She started dialysis in 2007. She made many friends. You're sitting beside someone for 3 to 4 hours. Even the nursing staff, the whole thing, it becomes a family.
But after a routine treatment, an unexplained heart attack has claimed Fran's life, and her loved ones are struggling to understand how it could have happened.
You don't expect typically for a dialysis patient to have a heart attack or get worse during dialysis, because the point of the dialysis is to be taking impurities out of the patient's blood.
I think that one of the hardest things for me was not to be able to have a goodbye moment with my mom. And so I reached down and I kissed her on the cheek. When I did, there was a horrible smell that burned my eyes and my nostrils. She smelled like bleach.
Fran's family has no way of knowing if the smell had anything to do with her death, but they are determined to find out what went wrong. Unfortunately, Fran wasn't the only death at the clinic that day.
Claire Strange was a grandmother. She was born during the Great Depression, and she worked on the family farm. She went to church. She was part of a tight-knit community, and she'd been on dialysis for about 8 to 9 years prior to her death.
At the time of April 1st, when she went to visit the dialysis facility, she was screened as normal, and again, an uneventful dialysis process would have been expected. She went into cardiac arrest and also died.
It's like, oh, Mother wasn't the only one. Claire Strange was a name that Mom had mentioned. That was a lady that was real sweet to her.
They both went into cardiac arrest within 30 minutes of each other.
To have 2 patients die on the same day is just, the odds of that are astronomically low.
Our minds are really beginning to start to inquire what was going on there, what was happening to these patients.
Coming up, the inexplicable deaths continue.
She had no immediate health problems, and she died almost immediately.
And patients witness a chilling scene.
Someone walked over to a bleach solution bucket on the floor and draw up that solution into a syringe.
After the unexplained deaths of Fran Metcalf and Clara Strange, family members are pressuring the DeVita Clinic for answers.
It was treated as a medical anomaly. Statistics are accurate to a point, but there's always the outliers.
DeVita was very concerned, and they began a very introspective process of trying to understand what was going on.
They initiated a procedure where they began saving items from cardiac incidents and reviewing the medical charts and seeing if there was any medical explanation for what caused those deaths.
During the following week, 5 more patients suffer cardiac arrests. Thankfully, they survive, but administrators are alarmed, to say the least.
DeVita sent high-level nurses to the facility to try observing if there was some breakdown in procedure or some kind of process that wasn't being done right. And they weren't able to find anything that could explain these untoward results.
After analyzing their procedures, the clinic could not identify an obvious cause for these cardiac events.
There's no indication to that point that there's any nefarious activity going on. These are health-compromised individuals to begin with, otherwise they wouldn't be on dialysis.
The clinic staff stays alert while they remain open to continue serving the community of Lufkin. But 15 days later, 2 more patients suffer cardiac arrests. One of them is 58-year-old Garland Kelly Jr.
My dad, Garland Kelly Jr., grew up in Lufkin, Texas, and he was on the championship team with the Dunbar High School football team.
Garland's wife, La Francis, was his high school sweetheart. Together, they built a home and raised 3 daughters.
He was an insurance salesman, so that was his primary occupation, and then he always officiated football games on the side, so that was like his little side hustle thing. He didn't meet a stranger, ever. Would talk to anybody and would just embrace everybody. It was probably when I was in high school, which would be like in the 80s, when he learned that he had diabetes. You know, obviously he wasn't happy about having to go on dialysis, but if that's what it took for him to live, then he, had to do it. He loved my mom. Their 40th anniversary would have been in March.
Now, just a month after his anniversary celebration, Garland has become the latest DeVita patient to suffer a cardiac arrest.
They obviously began resuscitation attempts. They were successful. His heart began to beat on his own, and he was transported to the hospital. He was placed on a ventilator.
We all got to the hospital around the same time, and it was just family there waiting to see what the outcome was. He was in a coma.
Unlike the other heart attacks, a clinic technician noticed something strange just before Garland coded.
She witnessed what she described, it looked like a black ball of hair that went through his line and into his system.
Whenever that clot appeared, he went into cardiac arrest. It was an anomaly for treatment. You often see clots when people are being dialyzed. This one had a very unique appearance.
With 2 deaths on their hands, the dialysis clinic initiates a new safety precaution.
DeVita instituted a policy of not reusing dialyzers. However, even under the monitors and the changes in policy and procedure, the deaths still continued.
Employees at the facility were on edge, and I think patients were acutely aware that something was amiss, something was wrong. But they needed this treatment in order to survive. It was so inconvenient for them to travel out to Livingston or out to Henderson, about an hour-and-a-half drive from Lufkin, in order to receive these treatments 3 times a week.
6 days after Garland Kelly, 2 more patients suffer cardiac events, including 63-year-old Cora Bryant.
Cora Bryant was a mother of 5 children. She had 13 grandchildren, and she did not let the fact that she was on dialysis control her life.
What Miss Bryant experienced that day was way outside the norm. Before Miss Bryant coded, she asked the nurse, "What did you give me?" That was overheard by multiple people around her.
Of course, no one knew what she meant by that then.
Like Garland Kelly Jr., the heart attack has left her in a coma. Before the end of the week, it happens 6 more times, including to Opal Mae Few.
Opal Few was a lady that was 90 or 91 years old, and she was very active, no expectation of any immediate health problems. And Ms. Few died almost immediately there in the facility.
My mother, Opal Mayhew, was raised in Pollock, which is just about 8 or 10 miles outside of Lufkin. My mom always said is that when she had her children, there was never any other goal in life other than to provide for them and to raise them to be the best people that they could be.
Opal had kidney issues later in life, and like the first victim, Fran Metcalf, she enjoyed the community of patients at the clinic. Now, she appears to have suffered the same fate.
I got the phone call that you don't ever want to get. And I didn't believe it. I was like, no, not my mom. There's no way that she could have died. I was overwhelmed by grief. There had been no news, no articles of the other people who had passed away, so I was unaware. There's been several deaths when she was there.
DeVita began to look at everything, the patient's medical history, the employees working, the practices, the water filtration, the medicine. They looked at everything.
Clinic administrators are at a loss to explain what's happening, so they finally decide to call in experts.
Toward the end of April, the DeVita company contacted the Centers for Disease Control and says, hey, can you help us? Can you send somebody? We've got patients getting sick and we can't tell why. We've checked everything we know. Help us, please.
For several weeks, the DeVita Clinic in Lufkin, Texas has remained open as they internally investigate over 24 emergency calls and 3 mysterious deaths. As no progress has been made, a doctor from the Center for Disease Control arrives to review the cases. He can't find any contaminants or natural causes, which leads him to one inevitable conclusion.
Through analysis of the statistical likelihood was that one of the employees might be killing people.
In most cases of healthcare killers, there are multiple victims. The most common way, over 50% of patients are killed through some type of injectable.
CDC suggested a serial killer, but there again, you always have to follow the evidence. At that point, you have somebody's observation. There was no playbook, as it were, on how to deal with this.
While the CDC suspects patients are being harmed intentionally, the clinic remains functioning with managers on high alert while they investigate further. Within days of the CDC doctor's assessment, 2 patients report suspicious activity.
On April the 28th, Lurleen Hamilton, Linda Hall were being dialyzed. They were already nervous, alert, and scared because of the number of deaths, so they were paying attention.
They started their treatment around 5:30 that morning. And Miss Hall noticed a nurse was acting fidgety, a bit out of sorts. That's what first drew her attention. She watched as the nurse walked over to a bleach solution bucket on the floor and crouched down and draw up that solution into a syringe. From there, she watched, incredibly, as that nurse walked over to another patient who was sleeping and then inject that solution into the lines.
The nurse moved sneakily. She was trying to hide the fact that she had done it. They didn't feel comfortable making an outcry because they were still hooked to machines, which that nurse had the responsibility of unhooking them from.
Ms. Hamilton got the patient care tech that she trusted and told her what she'd seen.
They were able to identify Kim Sines as being the person that injected the bleach.
The patient is immediately rushed to the hospital for treatment as the clinic's administrators approach Kimberly Clark Sines, a licensed vocational nurse on staff.
And they said, "Why don't you go home, take the rest of the day off? We've got a matter we need to look into." And so they sent Kimberly home.
And the administrators there secured where Miss Holland Hamilton said that they had seen Kim, the nurse, place the syringes after she was finished with them. They did their own investigation of those 2 sharps containers. They opened them up. They found syringes which were not marked, empty 10 ml syringes without needles.
DaVita administrators immediately close the clinic until the investigation is concluded and patient safety can be guaranteed.
By this time, it was about 4:30 in the afternoon, and they called the Lufkin Police Department and said, "We think we need to have the police come and let us turn this over to you."
The main thing we could do that night was seize everything that we could think of, take it back to the station, and then contact those who were much more knowledgeable than us about how to handle it. The decision we made that night was to take everything we could, because that medical waste contained in those 36 sharps containers was approximately 3 weeks worth of waste and covered the time period from April the 1st all the way up to April 28th.
With the evidence secured, Lufkin police look into Kimberly Sines.
Kim was born locally. She had lived here all of her life. She didn't graduate from high school. She had become pregnant during her time in high school and left school because of that. For a while, she was a happy homemaker. There was ultimately problems with her first marriage.
After divorcing her first husband in 1997, Kim remarried in 2000 and had another child.
She needed to find a career, and she went to school, and she became a nurse.
We learned that she was fired from Woodland Heights Hospital for suspicion of stealing patient medication. She had moved to a couple of different jobs, and then she landed at the DaVita dialysis facility. During the time that she went to work at the DaVita dialysis facility, she was under investigation by the Texas Board of Nurse Examiners for the alleged theft of patient medication.
In the medical profession, apparently, it's really easy to pass from job to job. You can leave employers off of your references and resumes. No documented background check is required.
There was a mixed bag in terms of opinions, even among her patients, on whether she really had done what she'd been accused of doing.
I found it hard to believe that one person could intentionally kill that many people for no apparent reason. Why in little old Lufkin would there be a serial killer?
Coming up, police come face to face with an angel of death.
If I'm doing something wrong, I want to know that I don't want to kill somebody.
And the truth behind the deaths comes to light.
She had typed in, "Can bleach be detected in a dialysis line?"
After patients witness a nurse appearing to inject bleach into a dialysis patient's lines, initial tests confirm their statements.
There were thousands of syringes in the sharps containers, and the police department took each container, took each syringe out and labeled them and tested them with litmus paper, and it tested positive for a basic solution. So it supported the story of Ms. Hamilton that bleach had been in the syringe.
There was no reason for anyone to ever use a syringe to draw bleach in to measure it. It just doesn't make any sense to me.
2 days into their investigation of the deaths at the Lufkin Dialysis Clinic, Detectives interview the accused nurse, Kimberly Signs.
We didn't lay our cards out on the table, what the witnesses had seen or anything like that right off the bat. We just wanted to hear her side of the events.
There's things that we want to sit down and discuss with you.
Hey, I've only been here 8 months. But I just wonder about the blood pressures, when they come in and they're really high. I get so scared they're going to stroke out. And it's just scary. And then they said that we've had so many deaths in the past 7 months. I'm scared to leave my patients. I'm just constantly, are you okay? Are you okay? Are you okay?
Before police bring up the accusations, Kim goes on the defense, clearly aware she had been reported by patients.
What hurts me the most is for 2 patients to accuse me of giving another patient medication that was not ordered.
Did you give her any medicine?
I did give her some saline, only because she said she was cramping.
She herself brought up the issue of bleach and sort of suggested ways that bleach could have gotten into the patients.
If our machines are hooked up and they have some bleach in them, I haven't researched into that, but I just have to wonder what kind of reactions would have happened, I know we bleach them every week.
That brings up red flags in and of itself because we hadn't told her what the allegations were. And here she is already trying to prepare a ready-made explanation.
Police have been told bleach is used for sanitizing equipment exteriors, but not the way Kim describes.
1 part bleach to 10 parts water is used as a disinfectant.
You use a syringe to pull your 10 cc's of bleach up?
Sometimes I do when I can't find the little medicines cups. There wasn't any cups up there that day. But if you use a syringe, 10 cc's, then you're going to have to, put it in the receptacle.
Investigators are skeptical.
I don't know what's going on here, and it's just scary. And if I'm doing something wrong, I want to know that I'm doing something wrong because I don't want to kill somebody.
Kimberly's interview is concluded, and she is allowed to leave.
We knew that the facility was closed and she wasn't going to be working on any other patients. It's frustrating. You may have a good idea in your head what happened, but until you can prove it, you understand you have to let them go.
After the interview, police continue testing the medical equipment involved.
Syringes that showed indications of having bleach they sent to a lab. DeVita had 8 sets of lines that came from patients who were believed to be victims.
This occurred over the period of about 3 or 4 days. The first thing we did was we identified that, yes, bleach was present in those sharps containers and in those syringes. Then we started trying to counteract that argument that she'd used it for measuring. We actually subpoenaed all the purchase orders to prove that there was cups always available. We also interviewed each employee to see if they'd ever heard of that being a practice or seen that being a practice, and none of them had.
The following day, Kimberly's husband Kevin provides some unexpected help.
Her husband had filed for a divorce. He actually contacted the police department.
Kimberly Signs had a lot of problems in her marriage and her personal life. Her husband, Kevin, he was fed up.
He advised that he had worked on a computer she was using, and during the process of that, he had found that she had a search history for using the word hemo. Hemodialysis is the full technical term for what was being done at DeVita. Based upon that information, we were able to get a search warrant to seize her computers.
They found searches on the computer about the effect of bleach on patients, and she had typed in a question on her computer: can bleach be detected in a dialysis line?
The terms bleach and bleach poisoning were done on April the 1st before she went to work. People died on that day.
As the testing and investigation continues over the next several months, the two surviving patients in comas sadly pass away. 63-year-old Cora Bryant and 58-year-old Garland Kelly Jr.
He was in the hospital from April to August. And we had scriptures all over the wall, and we just believed God that he would wake up, you know. And then he actually died August 16th of 2008.
There are now 5 deaths law enforcement believes are connected to Kimberly Signs. But to charge her, police still need solid evidence.
We still need the scientific proof that A, bleach had been introduced into those patients, and B, the introduction of that bleach had caused their deaths. And at that time, it wasn't there or available to us. Here's somebody that I believed had committed multiple murders on multiple occasions, and she's walking the street, so holding her accountable was a priority.
Investigators in Lufkin, Texas find themselves with a unique challenge. How to prove the existence of a serial killer without a clear murder weapon.
The mechanism of injury was the introduction of bleach into dialysis lines, and there's very little research where bleach has been used to injure somebody.
The black clot seen by a technician going through Garland Kelly's line provides a possible clue.
We suspected that bleach might change the color of blood, so we actually did an experiment where we went to the hospital and had them withdraw some arterial blood, which is bright red, from Sergeant Abbott, and we dropped some bleach in it, and it immediately turned black. What we believe is that the patient care technician witnessed the result of Kimberly Signs injecting bleach. Red blood cells, your little cells that flow in the veins and arteries. When they encounter bleach, they explode. If enough blood cells explode or burst, this releases potassium. Potassium gets to the heart, causes cardiac arrest.
What it probably felt like to my mom was being burned from the inside out. I can't imagine the pain that they went through.
How could another human being do that to anybody? And then to think that they not only did it to my mom, but they were doing it to multiple people, it was overwhelming.
But now detectives are faced with another problem.
It's one thing to say we think it's likely that the defendant in this case put bleach into the lines of her patients, but it's quite another then to be able to prove that that is what killed them, especially in patients who are already generally health compromised.
But there is no ordinary medical blood test to test for the presence of bleach.
We got a real break in the case when we found an expert who had been doing studies with rats involving chlorine gas. And chlorine is basically the same thing as bleach. This expert explained that if bleach had been introduced in significant amounts into the bloodstream of the patient, they should have an amino acid called chlorotyrosine that should be at a very high level within their system.
What he found is every blood sample from a suspected victim showed the presence of chlorotyrosine.
Police can now definitively say bleach was used to kill 5 patients and seriously injure several others. Now they just have to prove Kimberly Sines was the one who did it.
They looked at the employment records, and the only employee that was present for every cardiac event was Kimberly Sines. We presented it to the grand jury. We had 5 murder victims, and we had 5 people that we believe were injured by the injection of bleach that did not die but recovered. They returned an indictment for capital murder and then 5 counts of aggravated assault.
They agreed with us there was enough probable cause to issue an arrest warrant for Kim, and she was ultimately arrested April the 9th of 2009.
She had a $500,000 bond. We heard word through the community that she was bonded out.
Kimberly Sines was described as shy, kind, sweet. No one could believe that she was behind this.
The only restriction she had was not working in healthcare, and she was required to wear a GPS monitor.
It makes you angry to think about the person who took your mother's life, walking around free, able to wake up in the morning, able to do anything. It makes you angry.
Potentially responsible for the death of 5 seniors in the small town of Lufkin, Texas, Kimberly Sines remains free for nearly 3 years while prosecutors prepare their case against her. She is ultimately charged with murder for the deaths of Fran Metcalf, Clara Strange, Garland Kelly, Cora Bryant, and Opal May Few. And she is charged with assault for 5 surviving victims.
The case was pretty complicated, and her defense lawyer wanted records of DeVita, and he wanted an opportunity for other experts to review the records.
In March 2012, the trial finally begins.
I was able to go to the trial, not every single day. It was too overwhelming to listen, to look at her.
Kimberly Sines seemed very relaxed. She was cheerful, joking with her counsel. Just seemed like she did not understand that she was on trial for capital murder.
Kimberly's defense attorney uses the clinic's records to argue they are the real culprits.
He laid out a compelling argument that she was a scapegoat for this Fortune 500 company, and they were trying to pin it on one person in order to shift the blame.
One of his defensive theories was there was a chlorine leak, that somehow tap water was getting through into the system. Now, if there had been a tap water leak, everybody would have gotten sick because every patient got the same water, but only certain patients got sick and certain patients died.
The problem for the defense in that regard was we had repeated test results for the water showing that there was no bleach in it.
The trial lasted 4 weeks, and the jury deliberated part of one afternoon and into the next day, so it was quite a quick deliberation for the amount of evidence they had to go through.
On March 30th, 2012, the jury renders its verdict.
Kim Sines was convicted of capital murder and aggravated assault, 3 counts of aggravated assault, and acquitted on 2. She was sentenced to 1 term of life without parole and 3 counts of 20 years each for the assaults.
When the verdict was read, and then when sentence was passed, there was a sense of relief that she can't do it to anyone else.
The only real question is why, and everybody wants to know that. The only one that knows it is her, and until she explains it, nobody will know. It seemed like she was killing just indiscriminately for no reason. My personal theory, she couldn't control what was going on in her life, and I believe she took her frustrations out on those patients.
Her marriage was falling apart, and this was her way of asserting control and power in what was a very chaotic personal life.
All the other demons that she had in her life, I believe that's what caused her to snap.
Carlin Kelly Jr., the myth, the man, the legend. He was a man covered in the grace of God, had so much love.
My mom was a God-loving person, and she speaks to me a lot of times of just saying, Wanda, just let it go, forgive. And I know that she would have forgiven her, and I'm trying.
Cora Bryant died just a few weeks shy of her 65th birthday, and her family and her loved ones remember her as someone who had just a great sense of humor and laughter about her, and she loved her children and her grandchildren very much.
There's no way to really describe in words what my mom meant to us as a family. She was the glue that held us together. The loss that we endured, I can't convey in real words.
The call came in just after midnight. No panic in the voice.
No screaming.
Just a pause too long, too empty, before the line went dead. Dispatch logged it as a hang-up. Routine. But nothing about that night would stay routine for long. By sunrise, the house on the edge of the subdivision sat under a sky already burning with heat. Florida humidity pressed down like a weight, the kind that makes everything feel slower, thicker, harder to breathe. A patrol car idled in the driveway, engine running.
Door open.
Inside, nothing moved.
No overturned furniture.
No broken glass. No signs of a fight. Just stillness. And absence. Her name was spoken softly at first, almost carefully, as if saying it too loud might make the situation real. A woman in her early 30s.
Known.
Recognized. Not the type anyone expected to vanish. She wouldn't just leave. That sentence would echo through the investigation for years, repeated by neighbors,
friends, detectives.
She wouldn't just leave. But her car was still there. Her keys lay on the kitchen counter. A glass of water sat half-finished beside the sink, condensation still clinging to the surface, as if time itself had paused mid-breath. And her purse left behind. Everything that mattered still in place. Except her. The responding officer walked slowly through the house, boots soft against the tile. Every instinct told him something was wrong. Not violently wrong. Not chaotic. Controlled wrong. Like someone had stepped and done exactly what they came to do, and stepped back out without disturbing a single thing more than necessary. That was the first detail that stuck.
No noise. No struggle. No trace.
By mid-morning, detectives arrived. The yellow tape went up. Cameras flashed. Evidence markers dotted the floor, even when there was barely anything to mark. They documented everything. Every inch. Every object. But the deeper they looked, the less they found. Neighbors gathered at a distance, whispering behind hands, watching the scene unfold with a mix of curiosity and unease. One neighbor mentioned hearing something the night before. A car, maybe. Another thought they saw movement near the side yard. A shadow. But shadows don't hold up in reports. And memories shift under pressure. The timeline began to form, fragile and incomplete. She had been seen that evening.
Alive. Calm.
No sign of distress.
No argument. No threats.
No reason to believe anything was about to happen. Then midnight. The call. The silence. And nothing after that. Search teams were deployed before noon. Volunteers spread out across nearby woods, calling her name into the heavy air. Boats scanned canals. Helicopters cut through the sky above, their blades slicing the silence into fragments. But the land gave nothing back.
No footprints.
No discarded items. No sign she had ever left that house or how she could have been taken from it. The case shifted quickly. Missing person became suspected abduction. And with that shift came fear. Real fear. Because whoever had done this had done it clean. Too clean. Detectives turned inward. If there was no forced entry, no noise, no struggle, then the answer pointed somewhere uncomfortable. Someone she knew. Someone she trusted. The list of names grew. Friends, coworkers, former relationships, neighbors. Every connection mapped out. Every interaction examined. They looked for cracks. Inconsistencies. Something that didn't fit. But every door they opened led to the same thing. Nothing. Alibis held. Stories aligned. No one broke under questioning. No one slipped. And without evidence, suspicion means nothing. Days stretched into weeks. The media picked up the story. Headlines carried words that would define the case for decades. Mysterious disappearance. Community in shock. Vanished without a trace. Reporters stood outside the taped-off house, voices low, measured, trying to make sense of something that refused to be explained. The town watched. And waited. But waiting turned into something else.
Dread.
Because as time passed, hope began to thin. Search efforts slowed. Tips came in, then faded out. Each new lead brought a surge of energy followed by the same crushing result. Dead end. The detectives felt it too. That creeping realization that they weren't chasing a trail, they were standing in a void. And the void wasn't giving anything back. Months passed. The house was eventually cleared. The tape came down. Life, in appearance, returned to normal. But normal had changed. Doors locked earlier. Strangers were watched more closely. Every unfamiliar car parked on a quiet street drew attention. Because the question lingered. If it could happen once, it could happen again. The case file grew thicker, not with answers, but with attempts, interviews, reports,
Notes.
the quiet accumulation of effort against something that refused to be understood. And then slowly it began to cool. Not officially. Not yet. But in the way that matters. Fewer leads. Fewer calls. Less urgency in each new development. Other cases demanded attention. New crimes. New victims. And this one stayed behind. Waiting. Years passed. The file was moved.
Archived.
Revisited. Moved again. New detectives took over, bringing fresh eyes and new approaches. They read through every page, retraced every step, re-interviewed key witnesses. They searched for what had been missed. A detail overlooked. A statement that didn't quite align. Something buried between the lines. But the result remained the same. Nothing.
No suspect.
No evidence. No resolution. The phrase settled in permanently now. Cold case. 2 words that carry weight. 2 words that mean time has passed, and answers have not come with it. But for some, the case never cooled. It stayed alive in memory, in quiet moments, in the spaces between thoughts. One of those people was a detective who had been there from the beginning. He had walked through that house, seen the untouched glass on the counter, felt that same quiet wrongness settle into his chest. Years later, long after retirement, the case still followed him. Not loudly, not constantly, but persistently. Like something unfinished. He remembered details others had forgotten. Small things, subtle things. The way the air felt inside that house. The exact placement of objects. The silence. That silence. It didn't make sense. And that was the problem. Because crimes, no matter how careful, leave something behind. A mistake. A trace. A moment where control slips. But this one didn't follow the rules. Or maybe no one had been looking at it the right way. That thought stayed with him. Quiet at first, then louder, until it became something else. A question. What if the answer wasn't missing? What if it had been there all along? Just hidden in plain sight? He pulled the file again. Years later. Dust settling around the edges. Pages worn from handling. He read it slowly. Not like a detective chasing leads, but like someone listening for something beneath the surface. A pattern. A shift. Something that didn't belong. And as the hours turned into days, something began to move. Not outside. Inside the case itself. Connections that hadn't been seen before. Details that once felt insignificant now aligning in ways that couldn't be ignored. The past wasn't silent anymore. It was speaking. And for the first time in years, someone was finally listening. Florida 1991 cold case solved. Retired detective cracks case that haunted town. The file doesn't open with noise. It never did.
No dramatic breakthrough. No sudden confession.
Just paper. A stack of reports, yellowed at the edges, holding onto a story that refused to settle. He sits alone when he opens it again. No badge now. No authority. Just memory and a question that never stopped asking itself. What didn't we see? The air in the room feels different this time. Not heavy with urgency like it was in 1991. Not crowded with voices, radios, pressure. Now it's quiet, controlled. The kind of quiet where details can finally speak. He starts from the beginning, not skimming, not searching. Reading. Every word, every pause, every sentence written by hands that were rushing to catch something before it disappeared. And slowly something feels off. Not wrong. Incomplete. The timeline looks solid at first glance. It always did. Evening, last confirmed sighting. Night, no disturbances reported. Just after midnight, the call. Then nothing. But the more he studies it, the more the gaps begin to stretch. Not large gaps. Small ones. Subtle ones. The kind that hide in plain sight because they seem too insignificant to matter. He circles one detail. The call. That hang-up call that started everything. Back then it was treated as a clue, but also as noise. Something ambiguous. Something that could mean anything or nothing at all.
But now.
He looks at it differently. The timestamp. The duration. The silence. No voice. No background noise. No struggle heard over the line. Just connection and then absence. He leans back. If she made that call, why say nothing? If someone else made it, why make it at all? It wasn't a mistake. People don't accidentally dial and hold a line open in total silence.
Not like that.
Not for that long. That call wasn't random. It was intentional. And intention changes everything. He flips forward. Scene reports. Descriptions of the house.
Clean.
Ordered. Undisturbed. 2 undisturbed. There's a note in the margin of one report. Handwritten.
Quick.
Almost overlooked. Front door unlocked.
He stops.
That detail had been logged but never emphasized. Unlocked doors weren't unusual in that neighborhood back then. People felt safe, trusted their surroundings. But in a case like this, nothing is just normal. He replays it in his mind. An unlocked door. No forced entry. No sign of struggle. No noise reported by neighbors. That doesn't suggest intrusion. That suggests access. Familiar access. Comfortable access. Whoever came into that house didn't need to force their way in. And, more importantly, didn't need to rush. He keeps reading. Witness statements. They blur together at first.
Familiar patterns.
People trying to remember what they saw, what they heard, what they think might have mattered. But one statement catches his attention. A neighbor. They mentioned a car.
Parked briefly.
Engine running.
Late.
Very late. At the time, it was dismissed. Too vague. No description. No license plate. No clear identification.
But now.
He looks at the timing. It lines up. Too well. He traces the timeline again, slower this time. Last sighting. Quiet evening. Midnight call.
Car scene.
Silence. He taps the page lightly. A car doesn't just appear in the middle of the night for no reason.
Someone came.
Someone waited. Or someone left. And yet no one followed up on that lead deeply enough. Because there was nothing to chase. No description. No direction. Just a memory fading as soon as it was spoken. But to him, it's no longer nothing.
It's a piece.
A small one. But real. He continues. Interviews with people close to her. Friends. Co-workers. Names he remembers. Faces he hasn't seen in decades. He reads their statements again, this time not for what they say, but for how they say it.
Tone.
Timing. Gaps between answers. One name appears more than the others. Not as a suspect. Not officially. Just present. Always present. Around her. Near her. Part of her routine. Someone who knew her schedule. Knew her habits. Knew when she'd be home. Knew when she'd be alone. Back then, that familiarity meant nothing suspicious.
Now.
It feels different. Because familiarity creates opportunity. And opportunity creates access. He leans forward, reading that section again.
The alibi.
It was checked.
Confirmed.
But only loosely. A general statement. Nothing precise. Nothing pinned down to exact minutes. And in a case built on minutes, that matters. He circles the name. Not accusing. Not concluding. Just marking it. A point of interest.
A thread.
And threads, when pulled carefully, can unravel everything. Hours pass. The room darkens. But he doesn't stop. Because now the case feels different. Alive again. Not solved, not even close. But moving. Breathing. And the more he reads, the more the pattern sharpens. This wasn't random. It wasn't chaotic. It wasn't a crime of impulse. It was planned.
Quietly. Carefully.
Executed with control. Minimal risk. Minimal noise. Minimal trace. That kind of precision doesn't come from strangers. It comes from knowledge. From proximity. from someone who understood the environment well enough to move through it without being seen. He closes the file slowly. Not because he's finished. Because he finally sees something that had been invisible before. The case wasn't empty. It was selective. It only made sense if you looked at it from the right angle. And for the first time in years, he feels it. That shift. That quiet certainty that something is there. Something real. Something that had been missed. Outside, the night settles in again, just like it did back in 1991. Same heat. Same silence. Same feeling that something unseen is moving beneath the surface. But this time, the silence isn't empty. It's waiting. Because somewhere inside that file, inside those pages that had been read 100 times before, the truth is starting to take shape.
Slowly. Carefully.
And once it surfaces, it won't stay buried again. The name doesn't jump off the page at first. It lingers. Quiet.
Ordinary.
Easy to overlook. That's what made it dangerous. He stares at it longer this time, letting it sit in his mind without forcing a conclusion. Years ago, it had been just another entry in a long list of people connected to her life. Someone close enough to be questioned, but not close enough to raise alarms. Back then, proximity wasn't suspicion. Now it is everything. He reopens the interview transcript. The paper feels thinner than he remembers, like it's been worn down by time and neglect. The words haven't changed, but the weight behind them has. The answers are calm.
Too calm.
Measured.
Consistent.
Almost rehearsed. He notices something subtle, something that would have been easy to miss when the case was fresh and chaotic. Timing. Not what was said, but when it was said. There are pauses in the transcript. Small ones. Noted in parentheses. Subject hesitates. Brief silence. Clarifies statement. At the time, they meant nothing. People hesitate when they're nervous. When they're scared. When they're being questioned by police in the middle of a crisis.
But now,
those pauses feel different. Not nervous. Careful. As if each word had to be chosen correctly before it was allowed to exist. He reads the alibi again. It sounds solid.
Simple.
Too simple. A general location. A vague time frame. No specific witnesses tied directly to exact minutes. It was enough to pass back then. Enough to move on. Because there was nothing contradicting it.
But now.
He leans back slowly, eyes narrowing. Nothing confirmed it either. That's the problem. In a case built on absence, a weak alibi isn't neutral. It's a gap. And gaps are where truth hides. He flips to another section. Phone records.
Sparse.
Limited by the technology of the time.
But still something.
Incoming calls. Outgoing calls. Times stamped in neat, mechanical precision. He traces the sequence. Her last known activity. Then the hang-up call. Then silence. But there's another number listed earlier that evening. Short call. Brief. Almost insignificant.
He circles it.
Runs it through memory. And there it is again. The same name. The connection tightens, almost imperceptibly, like a thread being pulled from opposite ends. He doesn't jump to conclusions. Not yet. But the pattern is beginning to breathe. He stands, pacing slowly. The room feels smaller now, like the walls are closing in around the idea forming in his head. If that call mattered, if that connection meant something, then everything shifts. Because now this isn't just about opportunity. It's about timing. And timing is harder to fake than presence. He returns to the file, flipping pages faster now. Witness statements. Re-interviews conducted years later. He notices the change in tone. At first, people spoke with urgency, emotion, confusion. Later, their words become softer, more distant, less certain. Time erodes memory, but it also erodes lies. And sometimes, when people think no one is paying attention anymore, they relax. They say things slightly differently. Not enough to alarm, but enough to shift the shape of the truth. He finds it buried in a later statement. A small contradiction. Almost invisible unless you're looking for it. The timeline doesn't match perfectly anymore. A detail that had once been firm now bends slightly. A time that was once precise now becomes approximate. It's subtle, but it's real. And it matters. Because consistency is what protects a lie. And inconsistency is what exposes it. He exhales slowly. For years, the case felt like a void. Now it feels like a structure. Incomplete, but structured. And structures can be understood. Broken down. Rebuilt. He pulls out a blank sheet of paper and begins mapping it manually. Not relying on the old reports. Not trusting the original sequence. He builds his own timeline. Minute by minute. Call by call. Movement by movement. He places her at the center. Then places everyone else around her. Closer. Farther. Intersecting points. Moments where paths cross. Moments where they don't. And slowly, one path begins to stand out. Not because it's obvious. Because it fits too well. Too cleanly.
Like it had been designed that way. He stares at it.
The pattern doesn't scream. It whispers. But it's there. And once you hear it, you can't ignore it. He remembers the house again. The untouched glass. The silence. The absence of struggle. That kind of scene doesn't happen by force. It happens through trust. Through familiarity. Through a moment where the victim doesn't realize what's about to happen until it's already too late. That realization settles heavily in his chest. Because it changes the nature of the crime. This wasn't a break-in. It wasn't random. It wasn't chance. It was personal. And personal crimes leave emotional traces, even when physical evidence is gone. He returns to the interview again. Reads it differently this time. Not as an investigator. As a listener. What does the person feel? What are they hiding? Where do they avoid detail? Where do they give too much? Because sometimes, the truth isn't in what people conceal. It's in what they overexplain. He finds it. A section that runs longer than the rest. More detail than necessary. An attempt to anchor a moment too firmly in place. That's where the discomfort lives. That's where the mind tries too hard to convince.
He circles it.
Another thread. Another piece.
And now.
The threads are starting to connect. Not perfectly. Not completely. But enough to form something recognizable. A shape. A possibility. A direction. The case is no longer empty. It's shifting. Revealing itself slowly, like something buried just beneath the surface. He looks at the name again. It doesn't feel ordinary anymore. It feels central. Important. Dangerous. But he doesn't move yet. Not impulsively. Not without certainty. Because after all these years, this case deserves precision. He sits back down, hands resting on the file, eyes fixed on the pages that once held nothing. Now they hold everything. Or, at least, the beginning of everything. Outside, the world continues like it always has. Cars pass. Lights flicker. People move through their routines, unaware that something long buried is starting to rise again. Because the truth doesn't disappear. It waits. Patient.
Silent.
Until someone finally looks at it the right way.
And now,
after years of silence, the case is beginning to speak. And this time, someone is ready to hear what it's been trying to say all along. The pattern doesn't announce itself. It tightens.
slowly.
Quietly, like a noose being drawn 1 inch at a time. He stares at the timeline spread across the table, handwritten notes overlapping old reports, arrows cutting through years of assumptions. It no longer looks like a cold case file. It looks like a map. And every path leads back to the same point. The same name. He doesn't say it out loud. Not yet. Because saying it makes it real. And once it's real, there's no turning back. He leans forward, eyes fixed on the sequence he's rebuilt from scratch. Evening. Contact. A call that seemed insignificant at the time. A connection that wasn't followed deeply enough. Then midnight. The silent call. The neighbor's memory of a car. And then absence. Everything aligns too cleanly now. Not by coincidence. By design. He taps the paper lightly, once, twice, the rhythm echoing in the quiet room. If this is right, then the entire case was misread from the beginning. Not because the detectives failed. Because the crime was built to be misunderstood. He exhales slowly, the weight of the realization settling in. This wasn't just controlled. It was calculated. The kind of calculation that anticipates investigation. That plans for it. That leaves just enough normality behind to deflect suspicion while removing everything that matters. He flips back to the original scene report. Reads the description again, but this time he doesn't picture the house as a victim's space. He imagines it as a stage.
Set.
Prepared. Used. The glass on the counter.
The keys.
The purse. All left behind. Not forgotten.
Placed.
Deliberately. To tell a story. A story that says she never left. A story that says nothing happened here. And for years everyone believed it. Because it made sense. Because it fit the absence of evidence.
But now,
he sees it differently. If someone wanted to remove her without creating a scene, they wouldn't destroy the environment. They would preserve it. They would keep everything exactly as it was. So nothing raises alarm until it's too late. He closes his eyes briefly, reconstructing the moment in his mind. A knock at the door. Or maybe no knock at all. Someone familiar. Someone expected. The door opens easily.
no hesitation.
No fear. Conversation. Normal. Routine. And then, a shift.
Fast.
Controlled.
Silent.
No time to react. No time to fight. No time to make noise.
Just enough time
to disappear. His eyes open again. The silence in the room feels heavier now. Because the scenario fits. Too well. And when something fits this precisely, it's not imagination. It's memory trying to surface. He looks back at the name. All the pieces orbit it now. The call. The proximity. The weak alibi. The subtle inconsistencies over time. It's no longer just a thread. It's the center of the web. But one question still lingers.
Why?
He flips through background notes.
Personal history.
Connections. Fragments of a life intersecting with hers in ways that once seemed ordinary. But ordinary relationships can carry hidden weight. Unspoken tensions. Obsessions. Resentments that don't show on the surface. He searches for it. Not the obvious motive. The quiet one. The one that hides behind normal interaction. And then he finds something small. A note. Brief. Almost dismissible. A mention of tension. Nothing specific. Nothing dramatic. But enough to suggest. Not everything was as simple as it appeared.
He circles it slowly.
Because motive doesn't always scream. Sometimes. It whispers. And those whispers get buried when the focus shifts too quickly to evidence that never appears. He leans back, letting the full picture settle. For decades, this case was defined by what was missing.
Now,
it's defined by what was overlooked. The difference is everything. He stands and walks to the window. Outside, the night stretches out, quiet and unchanged.
just like it was back then.
But something is different now. Because the past isn't locked anymore. It's opening.
Piece by piece.
He knows what comes next. And it isn't comfortable. Because reopening a path like this means confronting a possibility that has lived unnoticed for years. It means looking at someone who was once cleared and asking the question again. Not as it was asked before, but correctly. With precision. With focus. With everything that's been learned since. He returns to the table, picks up the file, and places his hand flat against it. For a long time, this case belonged to the past.
Now,
it belongs to him again. Not officially, but completely. Because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. And once you understand the structure, you know where to press. He looks at the timeline one more time. This time, he doesn't see gaps. He sees movement. A sequence that leads somewhere real. Somewhere solid. Somewhere that can finally be tested. And that's when the realization lands fully. Not as a thought, but as certainty. This case was never unsolvable. It was waiting. Waiting for time to strip away assumptions. Waiting for memory to fade just enough. For truth to slip through the cracks left behind. He gathers the papers slowly, stacking them with care. Because what he holds now isn't just theory. It's direction. And direction changes everything. The silence that once defined this case is no longer empty. It's charged. Filled with the weight of something about to break. Because somewhere out there, the person who walked into that house, who left it untouched, who believed the absence of evidence would protect them forever, is still living with the certainty that they got away with it. That the night in 1991 would remain buried. Forgotten.
Cold.
But that certainty is starting to crack.
Slowly. Quietly. Just like the pattern did.
And when it finally breaks, everything that was hidden will have nowhere left to hide. The name is no longer just a name. It has weight now.
Shape.
Direction. He doesn't circle it anymore. He builds around it. Every note, every arrow, every reconstructed minute bends toward the same point, tightening the structure until it feels less like theory and more like memory finally correcting itself. But certainty is dangerous. Because certainty without proof is still nothing.
He knows that.
After all these years, instinct alone won't reopen a case. It won't move a system. It won't stand in a courtroom. What he has now is a pattern. What he needs is something real. He sits down again, slower this time, forcing himself to step back. to break the pattern apart instead of letting it pull him forward too fast. Where does it fail? That's the question. Because every theory looks perfect until you test it. He scans the timeline again, deliberately looking for weaknesses. The call,
The car.
the access,
The alibi.
each piece fits, but none of them, on their own, prove anything. Together, they form pressure. But pressure doesn't convict. Evidence does. He exhales long and steady.
If this person was involved,
If they walked into that house, if they removed her without leaving a trace, then they made a mistake. They had to. Everyone does. Even the most careful plan leaves behind something unintended, something small, something that doesn't make sense until years later, when everything else has been stripped away. The problem is finding it. He reaches back into the file, deeper this time, past the obvious sections, past the interviews and summaries, into the overlooked, the minor reports, the fragments, the things that didn't seem important enough to matter. That's where mistakes hide. Not in the center. At the edges. He finds an inventory sheet. Collected items.
logged, stored.
Most of it routine. Dust samples, fibers, environmental traces that led nowhere. But one entry makes him pause. A partial print. Not clean enough to identify. Not complete enough to compare. Just a fragment. Back then, it was useless. Technology couldn't do anything with it. So it was logged, filed, forgotten. He stares at it longer than necessary. Because now, decades later, that kind of fragment isn't meaningless anymore. It's potential. He leans forward, heart beating slightly faster. If that print came from inside the house, and if it doesn't belong to her, then it belongs to someone who was there. And if it belongs to someone who shouldn't have been there, then it changes everything. He flips through the pages again, searching for placement. Where was it found? A surface near the entryway. Subtle, easy to miss. Exactly where someone might pass through without realizing they left anything behind. He sits back, the realization settling in slowly. This isn't a coincidence. This is the mistake.
Small.
Invisible at the time. But real. And now usable. He looks back at the name again. For the first time, the gap between suspicion and proof feels smaller. Not gone, but narrowing. He stands, pacing again, the room no longer quiet but charged with movement, with possibility. If that print can be analyzed now, if it can be compared, then the case doesn't just reopen. It transforms. From theory to evidence. But there's another layer. Because evidence alone isn't enough after all this time. It needs context. It needs to fit into a narrative that holds under pressure. And that narrative has to be built carefully. He returns to the timeline once more, this time with the print in mind. Entry point. Movement through the house. Contact. Exit. The sequence sharpens. He can see it now, not perfectly, not completely, but enough to understand the flow. And the more he understands the flow, the more one detail begins to stand out. The timing of the exit. That neighbor's statement.
The car.
Engine running.
Late.
Too late for coincidence. If the suspect left the house, they didn't walk. They drove. And if they drove, then there's another mistake. Because vehicles leave traces too. Not always visible, not always immediate, but patterns.
Routes.
Habits. He searches deeper into old notes, looking for anything related to vehicles.
Mention.
descriptions, even speculation. And there it is again.
Vague.
Unconfirmed, but consistent enough to matter. A car seen.
Dark.
Stationary. Then gone. He exhales slowly. 2 points now. The print. The vehicle. Both small, both overlooked. But together, they form something stronger. Something that can be tested. Something that can be challenged. And if it holds, something that can finally break the case open. He stops pacing, standing still in the center of the room. For years, this case was defined by absence.
Now.
It's defined by presence. Hidden presence. Buried under assumptions. Ignored because it didn't fit the narrative at the time. But the narrative was wrong.
And now.
It's being rebuilt.
Piece by piece.
He looks down at the file again, at the name that once blended into the background. It doesn't blend anymore. It stands out.
Clear. Sharp.
Unavoidable. But this isn't about proving guilt yet. It's about opening the door. Creating enough pressure that the truth has nowhere left to go. Because after decades, people change. Memories fade. But fear stays. And when the past comes back, fear resurfaces with it.
He knows that.
He's seen it before. Cases thought to be buried suddenly rising again, forcing people to confront what they believed was gone forever. And when that happens, mistakes follow. New ones. Ones that don't have the protection of time. He closes the file slowly, not out of hesitation, but control. Because now, the direction is clear. The next step isn't just analysis. It's action. Careful, precise, deliberate. Because one wrong move, and everything retreats back into silence, back into absence, back into the cold. He looks out into the darkness again, the same kind of night that started it all. But this time, it doesn't feel empty. It feels watched, as if somewhere someone senses it. That shift. That pressure building again after all these years. Because the truth doesn't just emerge quietly. It disturbs. It unsettles. It forces its way forward. And when it does, the person who thought they were invisible, who believed the silence would protect them forever, will feel it. That slow tightening. That same pressure building now in this room. Because the case isn't cold anymore. It's moving. And this time, it's moving towards something real. Florida 1991 cold case solved. Retired detective cracks case that haunted town. The first thing he learns after reopening the case is that time does not destroy the truth. It buries it. Layer after layer. Report after report. Memory after memory. Until the truth becomes almost impossible to recognize. But almost is not impossible. And that is what keeps him moving. The old detective knows that the most dangerous moment in any investigation is not when there are no answers. It is when everyone believes there never will be. Because that is when people stop looking. That is when details disappear into forgotten boxes. That is when a cold case becomes something more than an unsolved crime. It becomes a permanent question hanging over everyone connected to it. And for decades, this Florida town lived with that question. What really happened that night in 1991? Now, for the first time in years, someone is asking it differently. Not with frustration. Not with desperation. With patience. With experience. With the understanding that sometimes the smallest details create the biggest cracks. He begins by revisiting the people who were closest to the case. Not the suspects. Not yet. The witnesses. The people who saw pieces of the story without knowing they were holding pieces at all. Because memories change. But they rarely disappear completely. They hide, waiting for the right question to bring them back. He starts with the neighbors. The same people who watched police lights fill the street decades earlier. The same people who stood behind yellow tape and wondered if someone among them knew more than they admitted. Some remember little. Some remember too much. One neighbor describes the night again. The unusual silence. The feeling that something was different. The car. That car. Years earlier, the detail had been treated as a possible mistake. Now, it becomes one of the strongest points in the entire timeline. Because the neighbor does not remember everything. But they remember one thing clearly. The car was there. And it was there at a time when it should not have been. The detective listens carefully. Not interrupting. Not leading. Because after decades, the truth often appears in the spaces between answers. The hesitation. The uncertainty. The sudden moments where someone says, "I don't remember," and then immediately remembers something else. Human memory is imperfect, but patterns are not. He writes down every detail, every movement, every location, every name. The old case file becomes something new. Not a collection of failures. A collection of opportunities. Then comes the evidence review. The part that could either confirm everything or destroy it. Because theories are easy. Proof is not. The partial fingerprint remains one of the most important unanswered questions. A tiny mark left behind. A silent witness. For years, it meant nothing. Technology had limitations. The database was smaller. Methods were different. Back then, investigators had to work with what they had. But time changed. Science changed. And sometimes, a clue doesn't become valuable until the world catches up to it. The sample is submitted again. The wait begins. And waiting is something investigators know too well. Because every cold case has a moment where everything depends on something outside their control. A test. A match. A result. Something that turns suspicion into reality. Days pass. Then weeks. The detective continues digging. Because he knows better than to depend on one piece of evidence. A case this old cannot stand on one discovery. It needs structure. It needs confirmation. It needs a story to make sense from every direction. So he returns to the timeline. Again. And again. He notices something that had been overlooked for years. The disappearance was not the only strange event that night. The strange part was what happened afterward.
No sudden panic. No obvious mistakes.
No desperate attempts to create an explanation. Whoever was responsible did not behave like someone trying to escape. They behaved like someone who believed they were safe. That changes the entire investigation. Because confidence comes from somewhere. People who are afraid make mistakes. People who think they are untouchable become careless in different ways. They keep routines. They continue normal conversations. They believe the past is locked away. And sometimes, that belief becomes their weakness. The detective begins examining what happened after the disappearance. Not just the night itself. The days. The weeks. The months. Because a person's behavior after a crime can reveal what their words never will. Did they ask the right questions? Did they seem surprised? Did they avoid certain conversations? Did they move on too quickly? Or did they perform grief because they knew everyone was watching? The answers are not immediate, but slowly, a picture forms. A person who remained close enough to the case to know what investigators were doing. Close enough to understand the investigation. Close enough to adjust. That detail bothers him. Because information is power. And someone connected to the case had access to information most people did not. They knew what police had found. They knew what police had not found. They knew the investigation was losing momentum. And for years, they lived with that knowledge. But now the past has returned. And the detective is bringing questions that were never asked before. Questions that do not rely on old assumptions. Questions that go directly to the gaps. Where were you? What did you know? When did you know it? Why did you say that? Why did you not say this? The kind of questions that make old stories uncomfortable. Because lies can survive time. But they struggle against precision. A few days later, the evidence report arrives. The envelope sits on the desk. Small. Almost ordinary. But inside could be the answer that an entire town waited decades to see. The detective opens it slowly. He has opened thousands of reports during his career. But this one feels different. Because this is not just another piece of paper. This is the possibility of closure. The result is not what everyone expected. It is not a dramatic announcement. Not a confession. Not a sudden revelation. It is something much quieter. A connection. A match. A name attached to a piece of evidence that had been silent for more than 30 years. For a moment, he simply stares. Because after so much time, after so many dead ends, the impossible has happened. The case has moved. The evidence is no longer frozen in the past. It is alive. And now there is no going back. The person who believed the years had protected them, who believed the case would remain buried forever, is suddenly facing something they never expected. The past remembered. The detective closes the report. The room is silent. But this time, the silence feels different. Not empty. Not hopeless. Heavy. Because the mystery that haunted the town for decades is no longer a mystery without direction. It has a path. It has evidence. And it has finally begun leading somewhere. Somewhere it should have reached a long time ago. The moment the evidence connects to a name, the entire case changes. Not because the mystery is over. Because the mystery finally has a direction. For more than 30 years, the disappearance existed in a place between memory and reality. A story people whispered about. A question that had no ending. A wound that never fully closed.
But now,
there is movement. A single piece of evidence has done what dozens of interviews, countless searches, and years of investigation could not. It has brought the past into the present. The retired detective sits alone with the report in front of him.
he reads it again.
Then again. Because after decades of dead ends, the human mind has trouble accepting an answer when it finally appears. Especially an answer that changes everything. The name on the report belongs to someone who was never considered the center of the investigation. Someone who existed in the background. Someone who had always been there, but never stood out enough to become the focus. That was the danger. The person closest to the truth was hidden behind normality. And normality can be the perfect disguise. The detective knows the next steps must be careful. One mistake could destroy everything. Cold cases are fragile. A wrong accusation. A careless leak. A premature confrontation. Any of those could give someone the chance to disappear again. Not physically, but emotionally. People retreat when they feel threatened. They change stories. They protect themselves. They remember differently. And after 30 years, memory is already a battlefield. So he does something unexpected. He waits. He studies. He watches. Because evidence gave him a name. But behavior will tell him whether the name means anything. He begins reviewing the person's life after 1991. Not searching for a dramatic confession. Not looking for a movie-like moment where guilt suddenly reveals itself. Real life rarely works that way. The truth is usually hidden inside ordinary days.
A job.
A relationship. A move. A change in behavior. Small decisions that reveal something underneath. He studies every available detail. Where the person lived. Where they worked.
Who they stayed connected with.
Who they avoided. And slowly, another pattern begins to appear. After the disappearance, life continued. But not normally. There were changes. Subtle ones. Changes that no one considered important at the time. A sudden distance from certain people. A shift in routines. A strange desire to avoid discussing the case. At the time, those details seemed meaningless.
Now,
they feel different. Because people react to secrets, even when they believe nobody knows. The detective returns to old interviews. The words are the same, but the meaning has changed. One statement stands out. A sentence that seemed harmless decades earlier. A simple comment about the investigation. Something about what police had discovered. Something about what they had not discovered. The detective stops. He reads the sentence again. Then slowly looks back at the date of the interview. A question forms. How did this person know that information? It was never released publicly. It was never mentioned in the media. Only investigators knew. Only people close to the investigation knew. And suddenly, a new possibility appears. Someone wasn't just connected to the victim. Someone was connected to the investigation itself. They knew what police were looking at. They knew what police were missing. And that knowledge may have given them confidence. The detective feels the case shifting again. Because now it is no longer just about what happened inside that house. It is about what happened afterward. How someone lived with what they knew. How they carried the weight of a secret for decades. Because secrets change people. They create habits. They create fear. They create moments where the truth almost escapes. The detective decides it is time to speak with the person again. Not as an accusation. Not as an interrogation. A conversation. The kind where silence becomes the most important answer. The meeting is arranged quietly.
no cameras. No dramática non cement.
Just two people sitting across from each other with 30 years of unanswered questions between them. The detective watches carefully. The first reaction. The body language. The eyes. The pauses. Because after all these years, people can prepare their words. But they cannot always prepare their instincts. The conversation begins calmly. The person remembers the case. Of course they do. Everyone connected to that night remembers. The town remembers. The victim's family remembers. The detective remembers. But something feels different. There is a tension beneath the surface. A discomfort. A sense that the past is not as distant as it should be. The detective asks simple questions first. Where were you that night? What do you remember? Who did you speak with? The answers come quickly. Almost too quickly. A familiar story. A story repeated many times before. But repetition is exactly what the detective is listening for. Because a story told too many times can become polished. And polished stories sometimes reveal where the rough edges were removed. He changes direction. Asks about smaller details. Things that should not matter. Things that someone innocent might answer naturally. The response changes. A pause. A correction. A slight shift. Nothing dramatic. Nothing anyone else would notice. But the detective notices. He has spent his career looking for moments exactly like this. Tiny fractures. Small breaks in certainty. The conversation ends.
No confession. No breakdown.
No dramatic conclusion. But the detective leaves with something more valuable. Confirmation. Not legal confirmation. Not proof. A feeling that the pressure is working. Because the person across from him knows something has changed. The case is no longer buried. The past is no longer silent. And for the first time in decades, the person who thought time was their protection is forced to look back. The investigation accelerates. New evidence requests are submitted. Old records are examined. Every detail is reviewed under a new light. And then comes another discovery. A detail hidden inside financial records from the early investigation. Something small. A transaction. A movement. A location. Nothing that solved the case by itself. But another piece. Another connection. Another reason to keep going. The detective begins to understand something important. The case was never missing everything. It was missing the right combination. Each clue alone was weak. The fingerprint. The phone call. The car. The timeline. The inconsistent statements. But together, they created a story. And stories are powerful. Because people can argue with one piece of evidence. They struggle against an entire chain. The town begins hearing whispers again. Not rumors. Not speculation. Something is happening. The cold case that everyone thought would remain frozen forever is moving. The same streets that once carried fear now carry a different feeling. Hope. After decades, the question that haunted families and investigators is finally approaching an answer. But the detective knows something else. The closer the truth gets, the more dangerous the moment becomes. Because every cold case has a final battle. Not against time. Against denial. The person responsible has spent years building a life around one belief. That nobody would ever find the truth. That the evidence was gone. That the past belonged to another world. But they were wrong. The past was waiting.
And now,
it has returned. The file that once represented failure now represents something else. A warning. A reminder. That no matter how much time passes, some secrets refuse to stay buried. And after 30 years of silence, the voice of the cold case is finally getting louder. The investigation reaches the point every cold case eventually fears. The moment when suspicion becomes impossible to ignore. For years, the person at the center of the mystery lived behind a wall built from time, routine, and silence. 30 years is a long time. Long enough for people to believe the past has lost its power. Long enough for memories to fade. Long enough for a person to convince themselves that whatever happened in 1991 belongs to another lifetime. But time does not erase everything. Sometimes. Time preserves. It preserves mistakes. It preserves contradictions. It preserves the small details people thought nobody would ever find. And now those details are coming together. The retired detective knows the investigation has reached a dangerous stage. because the evidence is no longer just pointing backward. It is pointing directly at someone who never believed they would be questioned again. The next challenge is proving the connection beyond doubt. The fingerprint opened the door. The timeline created the path. The statements created the pressure. But a case built after decades needs more than suspicion. It needs a final bridge between what investigators believe happened and what can be proven. So the detective goes back one more time. Not to the crime scene. Not to the old reports. To the people.
Because people change.
And sometimes the person who spent years hiding a secret forgets that hiding requires effort. It requires remembering the lie, maintaining the story, keeping every detail consistent. And eventually, something slips. The detective begins comparing old statements with newer ones. The differences are small, almost invisible. A different description. A changed timeline. A detail remembered differently. Any single inconsistency could be explained. Memory is imperfect. Age affects recall. Time changes perspective. But when the same person changes the same details repeatedly, that is no longer just memory. That becomes a pattern. And patterns are what solve cold cases. The detective creates a timeline of every known statement. The first interview. The follow-up interview. The later conversations. The recent meeting. Every word placed beside the next. And slowly, something emerges. The story did not change dramatically. That would have been obvious. It changed carefully. Almost naturally. The kind of changes people make when they are trying to protect something. Not inventing a new story. Adjusting an old one. Making small repairs. Covering small cracks. But cracks still remain cracks. And once they are found, they become impossible to ignore. The detective focuses on one moment. One answer. One detail that has changed more than once. The person's location on the night of the disappearance. It was never a major issue before. The alibi was accepted. The explanation seemed reasonable. But now, after rebuilding the entire timeline, that answer becomes the center of the investigation. Because the question is no longer, could this person have been there? The question becomes, why did their story need to change? That is a different question. A more dangerous one. The detective begins searching records connected to that night. Old employment documents. Travel records. Phone information. Anything that can place a person somewhere at a specific moment. Because after 30 years, memories can be manipulated. Records cannot. And then, another piece appears. Not the dramatic breakthrough people expect.
No hidden confession.
No shocking discovery in a forgotten room. Something smaller. A record showing a movement that does not match the original story. A small gap. A missing piece. A few minutes that were never explained. But in a case like this, minutes matter. Because the entire crime happened inside minutes. The disappearance. The silence. The exit. Everything depended on timing. And now the timing is starting to collapse. The detective looks at the evidence board. The same board that once represented confusion now shows something else. A sequence. A beginning. A middle. An end. The disappearance was not random. The person responsible knew the victim, knew the environment, knew how to avoid attention, and, most importantly, knew what investigators would probably look for. That knowledge was the key. Because the biggest mistake was assuming the crime was committed by someone trying to hide. Maybe it was committed by someone who believed they understood the investigation better than investigators themselves. Someone who believed they were always one step ahead. Until now. The detective prepares for the next interview. This time, everything is different.
No assumptions.
No emotional pressure.
Just facts.
He knows confrontation is not about anger. It is about creating a moment where the truth has fewer places to escape. The person arrives.
Calm.
Controlled. Still carrying the same confidence that has protected them for decades. But something has changed. They know. They know the case is different. They know the detective has something. The conversation begins. The same questions. The same answers. But then the detective introduces the first piece of new information. Not everything. Just enough. A detail. A fact. A connection. The reaction is immediate. Small. Almost invisible. But real. A pause. A change in breathing. A moment where the carefully built wall becomes slightly unstable. The detective notices. He does not push. Not yet. Because the goal is not to win an argument. The goal is to watch. To let silence do the work. And silence becomes powerful. Because silence forces people to fill it. They explain. They justify. They defend. And sometimes, they reveal. The conversation continues for hours. The person repeats the same story. But now the story sounds different. Because the detective knows what to listen for. Not the words. The spaces between them. The missing pieces. The things avoided. The things corrected too quickly. By the end of the interview, there is still no confession. But there is something else.
A shift.
A realization that the old protection is gone. The case is no longer a forgotten file sitting in storage. It is alive again. And it is getting closer. The detective returns home that night carrying the weight of the investigation. He knows the final steps will be the hardest. Because solving a cold case is not only about finding the truth. It is about proving it. And proof requires patience. Precision. Discipline. The town waits. The family waits. Everyone connected to the case waits. For 30 years, they waited for an answer that never came. Now, finally, the silence is breaking. The cold case that haunted Florida for decades is no longer just a story of loss. It is becoming a story of reckoning. Because somewhere beneath all the years, all the excuses, all the forgotten memories, the truth remained exactly where it had always been. Waiting.
And now,
it is almost ready to be found. The mountain air of North Carolina in the late autumn of 2026 was a sharp, biting contrast to the thick, swampy heat of the Florida coast that David Miller had carried in his bones for over 3 decades. Up here, high in the remote, heavily forested ridges where the trees stood like silent, bare sentinels against a pale gray sky, the passage of time felt different, slower, colder, and utterly detached from the frantic pace of the modern world below. Miller sat in the passenger seat of an unmarked rental SUV, his hands wrapped tightly around a steaming paper cup of black coffee, his eyes never wavering from the narrow, gravel driveway that snaked up through the dense pines toward a secluded, weathered log cabin. Beside him, Detective Sarah Jenkins adjusted the heater of the vehicle, the soft hum of the blower the only sound breaking the heavy silence that had settled between them over hours of watchful waiting. They were hundreds of miles away from their jurisdiction, operating in a gray area of law enforcement coordination, relying entirely on the goodwill of the local sheriff's department and the absolute secrecy of their surveillance operation. For 3 days, they had lived in this vehicle, eating stale sandwiches, sleeping in cramped, uncomfortable shifts, and watching the cabin with a level of intensity that only a 35-year-old obsession could fuel. To anyone passing by on the lonely mountain road, they were just tourists or land surveyors, but in reality, they were ghost hunters, waiting for a specter from 1991 to step out into the cold morning light. Through the high-powered lens of his binoculars, Miller watched the front door of the cabin, his heart skipping a beat as the heavy wooden door slowly creaked open, revealing a figure dressed in a faded flannel shirt and thick canvas trousers. Arthur Pendleton stepped onto the porch, his movements slow and deliberate, carrying the physical burden of his 70 years, a far cry from the agile, shadowy predator who had slipped through the Florida sawgrass so long ago. Yet, as Miller focused on the man's face, tracing the sharp, angular line of his jaw and the cold, hooded structure of his eyes, all doubts evaporated from his mind. This was the face that had haunted his dreams, the missing piece of the puzzle he had spent his entire adult life trying to solve. Pendleton stood on the porch for several long minutes, cradling a white ceramic mug, his gaze sweeping across the misty valley below with the quiet confidence of a man who believed his secrets were buried so deeply that not even God could unearth them. There was an insufferable arrogance in his peace, a quiet, domestic tranquility that stood as an insult to the memory of Clara Vance, whose life had been violently stolen before she could ever know the quiet comfort of growing old. Miller felt a sudden, hot surge of anger tighten in his chest, a raw emotion he had to quickly suppress, reminding himself that anger was a liability, that they needed ironclad, scientific proof before they could make their move. The plan they had devised with the local authorities was delicate, requiring a surgical precision to ensure they did not violate any constitutional protections that a clever defense attorney could later exploit to throw the case out of court. Under federal and state privacy laws, abandoned property, such as trash left at the edge of a public roadway, is considered fair game for law enforcement seizure, requiring no search warrant or probable cause to collect. This legal loophole was their only shot. They had to wait for Pendleton to discard something containing a viable sample of his DNA, a cup, a cigarette butt, a discarded utensil, anything that could be analyzed by the state crime lab. On the fourth morning of their stakeout, the opportunity finally presented itself when Pendleton emerged from his cabin carrying a heavy, black plastic trash bag, walking it slowly down the long, gravel incline toward the metal bin positioned at the very edge of the public asphalt. Miller's grip on his coffee cup tightened so hard the cardboard buckled, his breathing shallow as he watched the elderly man toss the bag into the bin, secure the latch to keep out wild animals, and turn to walk back up the driveway. The moment Pendleton's figure disappeared behind the thick curtain of pine trees, Jenkins shifted the SUV into drive, gliding forward with the engine running as quietly as possible, stopping directly adjacent to the trash receptacle. Miller did not hesitate. He opened the passenger door, stepped out into the crisp, freezing mountain air, and reached into the metal bin with gloved hands, lifting the black plastic bag out with a swift, practiced motion. He replaced it with an identical, empty black bag to avoid raising any immediate suspicion if Pendleton were to look down from his porch, then retreated back into the warmth of the SUV, placing the seized property in a sterile evidence container in the rear seat. The entire operation took less than 40 seconds, a silent, seamless theft of a man's discarded life that would ultimately seal his fate in a court of law. They drove away from the mountain pass at a normal, legal speed, the tension in the vehicle evaporating into a state of quiet, electric excitement as they headed directly toward the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation Laboratory in Raleigh. Jenkins had already coordinated with the lab directors, securing a priority slot for an emergency forensic analysis, presenting the case as a high-profile, multi-jurisdictional homicide investigation with an active flight risk. The drive to the Capitol was a blur of highway markers and silent anticipation, with Miller's eyes constantly darting to the rear-view mirror, half expecting to see a ghostly patrol car or a vengeful predator pursuing them through the mountain fog. Inside the sterile, brightly lit corridors of the State Forensic Laboratory, the atmosphere was one of clinical, detached efficiency, a world of white coats, spinning centrifuges, and humming mass spectrometers that cared nothing for the emotional weight of the evidence they processed. Miller and Jenkins stood behind the double-paned observation glass of the DNA extraction unit, watching as a young technician meticulously opened the seized trash bag, cataloging its contents with a cold, systematic precision. Among the mundane detritus of a solitary life, soup cans, junk mail, and coffee filters, the technician extracted a white styrofoam coffee cup with visible dark stains around the rim and a crumpled, used paper tissue. These items were carefully placed under a laminar flow hood, where sterile swabs were used to collect the epithelial cells left behind by the suspect's lips and nasal secretions, an invisible harvest of genetic code that held the key to a 35-year-old mystery. The extraction process, which once took weeks or even months in the early days of forensic science, was now a highly automated sequence that could yield a complete 19-locus genetic profile in a matter of hours. Miller watched the digital timers on the laboratory machines count down, each second feeling like an eternity, his mind racing back to the dark, humid bedroom in Cypress Bend, comparing the high-tech reality of 22/6 with the primitive, frustrating limitations of 1991. The hours dragged on into the late afternoon, the sun dipping below the Raleigh skyline, casting long, amber shadows across the laboratory parking lot as Miller paced the linoleum floor of the waiting room, his boots squeaking in the quiet. He knew that this was the definitive moment of his career, the dividing line between a retirement spent in the suffocating grip of unresolved guilt and a future where he could finally look at his own reflection without seeing the ghost of Clara Vance. When the heavy wooden door of the administrative office finally clicked open and the lead geneticist stepped out holding a single sheet of paper, the look of solemn intensity on her face made Miller's breath catch in his throat. She didn't say a word at first. She simply walked over to where the two detectives stood, laid the paper flat on the table, and pointed to a series of vertical black bars representing the matching alleles of the two DNA profiles. On the left was the profile recovered from the victim's fingernails in 1991, preserved through decades of bureaucratic changes and temperature fluctuations. On the right was the fresh, robust profile extracted from the styrofoam cup. Every single locus, every marker, every genetic variant matched with absolute, mathematical perfection, a scientific certainty so overwhelming that it defied any statistical possibility of coincidence or error. The probability of the matching DNA belonging to another individual was calculated at 1 in 84 trillion, a number larger than the total number of human beings who had ever walked the earth since the dawn of time. Miller looked at the paper, his vision blurring slightly as a wave of profound, physical relief washed over him, a sensation so intense it made his knees feel weak, lifting a weight from his chest that he had carried for over half his life. Jenkins let out a sharp, triumphant breath, immediately reaching for her phone to contact the Florida State Attorney's Office and the local sheriff in North Carolina to initiate the emergency arrest protocols. The machinery of the justice system, which had remained frozen and inactive for 35 long years, suddenly roared to life with a terrifying, unstoppable momentum, coordinating state lines, arrest warrants, and tactical teams in a matter of minutes. The warrant for fugitive justice, charging Arthur Pendleton with homicide in the first degree, was signed by a circuit judge via electronic signature, clearing the way for the local authorities to move in on the mountain cabin. Miller walked out of the laboratory building into the cool evening air, looking up at the stars beginning to pierce through the twilight, knowing that the long, dark shadow that had hung over the town of Cypress Bend was finally, inexorably, about to be shattered. The blue and red emergency lights of 6 tactical vehicles sliced through the thick mountain fog like laser beams, casting eerie, rotating reflections against the wet pine needles and the dark, towering trunks of the North Carolina wilderness. There was no sound of sirens, no blaring horns. The arrest team moved with a silent, military-like precision, their headlights turned off as they navigated the winding gravel road that led to Arthur Pendleton's secluded cabin. David Miller sat in the rear of the lead sheriff's vehicle, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on the silhouette of the house that slowly materialized out of the misty darkness at the top of the ridge. His heart hammered against his ribs with a powerful, rhythmic thud, a sensation of pure, concentrated adrenaline that he had not felt since his days as an active detective on the neon-lit streets of Miami and the quiet suburbs of Cypress Bend. Beside him, Detective Sarah Jenkins checked her service weapon one last time, the metallic slide of her automatic pistol chambering around with a sharp, definitive click that broke the quiet inside the cabin of the SUV. The local tactical officers, clad in heavy body armor, ballistic helmets, and carrying tactical shields, stepped out of their vehicles into the freezing night air, their boots crunching softly on the wet gravel as they fanned out to surround the perimeter of the property. Every exit was blocked, every escape route into the dark, tangled forest was sealed, and the long, 35-year run of the man who had evaded the law was about to reach its absolute, dramatic conclusion. Miller watched from the safety of the perimeter as the tactical team leader approached the wooden front door, his heavy battering ram held low, while two other officers stood ready with their rifles raised, their weapon-mounted lights illuminating the faded paint of the entrance. The silence of the mountain was suffocating, a breathless instant where the entire world seemed to pause, waiting for the inevitable collision between the past and the present. With a voice of thunder that shattered the night, the lead officer shouted the command to open the door, his words echoing across the valley, followed immediately by three massive, deafening blows of the ram that splintered the heavy oak frame into a shower of white wood chips. The door swung open with a violent crash, and the tactical team flooded into the warm, dimly lit interior of the cabin, their lights cutting through the haze of wood smoke and the scent of old paper that filled the living room. "Police! Search warrant! Get on the ground! Show me your hands!" The commands barked out in rapid, overlapping succession, a wall of sound designed to disorient and overwhelm any potential resistance. Miller stood near the edge of the porch, his eyes wide as he listened to the scuffling of heavy boots on hardwood floors, waiting for the single sound he dreaded most, the crack of a gunshot. But instead, there was only the dull thud of a body being guided to the floor and the metallic, double click of handcuffs securing a suspect's wrists. A minute later, the tactical commander radioed back the code that everyone had been waiting to hear for over 3 decades. "Suspect in custody. No injuries. Scene is secure." Miller let out a breath he felt he had been holding since 1991, stepping across the threshold of the cabin and into the warm, cluttered living space where Arthur Pendleton was now seated in a wooden chair, his hands cuffed tightly behind his back. The elderly man looked incredibly small and fragile in the center of the room, surrounded by heavily armed officers, his white hair disheveled and his pale, watery eyes blinking rapidly against the glare of the tactical flashlights. There was no rage in his expression, no desperate attempt to struggle or deny his identity. Instead, a strange, hollow resignation seemed to have settled over his wrinkled face, as if a great, exhausting performance had finally come to an end. Miller walked slowly toward the chair, stopping just a few feet away, looking down at the man who had occupied his thoughts, his files, and his nightmares for 35 years, feeling a complex wave of emotions that was part triumph and part profound, empty sadness. "Arthur Pendleton," Miller said, his voice low and steady, carrying the weight of a lifetime of searching. "My name is David Miller. I was the lead detective on the Clara Vance homicide in Cypress Bend, Florida, in July of 1991. You are under arrest for first-degree murder." Pendleton did not flinch at the sound of Clara's name. He slowly lifted his head, his eyes meeting Miller's gaze with a cold, glassy stare that possessed an unnerving neutrality, a detachment that sent a shiver down the retired detective's spine. "I knew this day would come," Pendleton whispered, his voice dry and raspy, carrying the soft, flat cadence of the Midwest. "I've been waiting for you to find me. Every time a car drove up this mountain, every time the phone rang at an odd hour, I thought it was the police from Florida coming to take me back." He looked around his warm cabin, at the shelves filled with books on forestry, the stone fireplace, and the small television in the corner, realizing that the quiet, peaceful life he had stolen from Clara and built for himself in the mountains was gone forever. The local officers began the process of searching the cabin, cataloging his personal items, his computers, and his paperwork, looking for any trophies or journals he might have kept from his time in Cypress Bend, while Jenkins read him his constitutional rights from a small laminated card. Pendleton nodded his head in understanding, his compliance almost disappointing to the officers who had expected a fight from a man who had committed such a brutal, calculated act of violence in his youth. The transport vehicle arrived shortly after, its tires kicking up gravel as it backed up to the porch to receive the prisoner for the long journey down the mountain and across state lines back to Florida. As Pendleton was led out of the cabin, his head bowed against the cold mountain wind, a crowd of local reporters who had somehow gotten wind of the operation stood at the edge of the police tape, their camera flashes illuminating the dark trees in frantic, strobe-like bursts. The contrast was stark, the quiet, unassuming elderly man who looked like a harmless grandfather being escorted by federal agents and state police, a visual representation of the hidden monsters that can live among us unnoticed for decades. Miller stood on the porch, watching the taillights of the transport van disappear into the thick, white fog, knowing that the easy part of the mission was over and the difficult, public phase of bringing this cold case to a final, legal resolution was just beginning. The mountains of North Carolina were already receding into the background as he and Jenkins prepared for their own return flight to Florida, where an expectant town, a grieving family, and a waiting courtroom were preparing to face the ghost of 1991. The drive back to the airport was silent, the hum of the tires on the wet asphalt a soothing background to the storm of thoughts racing through Miller's mind as he mentally prepared for the trial and the media circus that would inevitably follow. He knew that a DNA match was the gold standard of evidence, but he also knew that a skilled defense attorney would try to attack the age of the sample, the storage conditions of the evidence locker, and the methods used to collect the trash from Pendleton's driveway. He had to ensure that every document, every chain of custody signature from the last 35 years was completely flawless, a monumental task that would require him to dive back into the dusty archives of the Cypress Bend Police Department. But as he looked out the window at the first light of dawn breaking through the gray clouds, Miller felt a sense of clarity and purpose that had eluded him. For his entire retirement, a quiet confidence that the truth was finally on his side and that Clara Vance's voice would finally be heard in a court of law. The humid warmth of Florida was waiting for them like a heavy, familiar coat as the plane touched down on the tarmac, the afternoon sun beating down on the concrete and reflecting off the palm trees that lined the perimeter of the airfield. For David Miller, stepping out into the thick, saltwater-tinged air felt like crossing a threshold back into his own past, a return to the territory where his youth, his peace of mind, and his early career had been buried alongside Clara Vance. The news of Arthur Pendleton's arrest had already crossed the state lines ahead of them, spreading through the media channels like a wildfire in the dry Everglades, igniting a wave of public interest and media coverage that Cypress Bend had not witnessed in over 35 years. Television satellite trucks were already parked outside the county courthouse, their massive antennas pointed toward the sky, while reporters stood in front of bright lights, rehearsing their updates for the evening news under the blazing sun. Inside the police department, the atmosphere was electric. Detectives from every division stood in the hallways, speaking in hushed, excited tones as the retired legend who had cracked the town's most infamous cold case walked through the double doors of the precinct. Miller did not stop to bask in the admiration or the handshakes of the younger officers. His focus was entirely on the final, crucial step of the journey, the grand jury indictment and the preparation of the trial that would seal Pendleton's fate forever. In the archives of the Cypress Bend Police Department, Miller and Sarah Jenkins spent 48 continuous hours going through the yellowed paper documents and the faded evidence logs of 1991, ensuring that every single link in the chain of custody was absolutely unbreakable. They verified the temperature logs of the forensic freezer, where the original biological samples had been kept, cross-referenced the signatures of every technician who had handled the evidence over 3 decades and built an ironclad timeline that left no room for the defense to argue contamination or negligence. When the state attorney called the grand jury to order, the presentation of the case was a masterclass in forensic persistence, combining the vintage, boots-on-the-ground investigative notes of Miller's youth with the cutting-edge genetic science of 22-6. The grand jurors listened in absolute, breathless silence as Miller described the meticulous nature of the crime scene, the chilling patterns of Pendleton's movements, and the final, undeniable verdict of the matching 19-locus DNA profile. It took the grand jury less than 15 minutes of deliberation to return a true bill, indicting Arthur Pendleton on charges of first-degree premeditated murder, burglary with assault, and kidnapping, ensuring that the suspect would remain behind bars without bond until his day of reckoning before a judge. The arraignment was a somber, highly charged event that drew the surviving members of the Vance family, who sat in the front row of the gallery, their faces etched with the deep, permanent lines of a lifetime spent waiting for an answer. When Pendleton was led into the courtroom, dressed in the bright orange jumpsuit of the county jail and secured with heavy ankle chains, a collective gasp rustled through the benches, a physical reaction to the sight of the monster who had hidden in plain sight for so many years. He looked older, weaker, and completely stripped of the quiet, mountain man dignity he had maintained in North Carolina, his eyes fixed on the floor as the judge read the formal charges against him. The defense attorney, a prominent local lawyer hired by Pendleton's remaining family, made a desperate attempt to argue for a reduced bail, citing the defendant's advanced age, his lack of a recent criminal record, and his deteriorating physical health. But the prosecutor, backed by the silent, powerful presence of Miller standing in the back of the room, painted a devastating picture of a cold-blooded killer who had enjoyed 35 years of unearned freedom while his victim lay in a cold grave, prompting the judge to deny bail with a sharp, echoing slam of his gavel. In the weeks that followed, the pressure of the impending trial and the overwhelming weight of the forensic evidence began to take their toll on the defense's strategy, forcing them to realize that a trial would only result in a public exposure of the most horrific details of Pendleton's obsession. Faced with the prospect of spending his remaining days in a maximum security state prison or facing the death penalty, Pendleton's legal team approached the state attorney's office with an offer of a full, detailed confession in exchange for a plea agreement of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Miller was consulted on the deal, and after a long, emotional meeting with Clara's elderly siblings, it was agreed that a plea would spare the family the trauma of a lengthy, graphic trial while still ensuring that the killer would die behind bars. The confession room was silent, the air conditioned to a freezing chill, as Pendleton sat across from Miller and Jenkins, his voice a flat, monotonous whisper as he detailed the dark genesis of his crime. He admitted to watching Clara through his surveyor's equipment for weeks, mapping her routines, learning the layout of her home, and waiting for the exact moment when the world was asleep to satisfy a dark, inexplicable urge that had dominated his thoughts since his youth. The detailed confession was the final, devastating piece of the puzzle, a chilling confirmation of the profile Miller had built in his mind during those endless, sleepless nights of 1991, proving that the instincts of the young detective had been correct from the very beginning. Pendleton described how he had cleaned his boots, disposed of his clothes in a deep swamp canal, and fled the state of Florida shortly after the murder, believing that the passage of time and the distance of the mountains would eventually wash away the blood on his hands. But the science of the future had caught up with the crimes of the past, demonstrating that the signature of a killer is written in a language that never fades, waiting for the technology of tomorrow to decode the secrets of yesterday. The formal plea hearing was brief, but heavy with emotion, as the judge accepted the guilty plea and sentenced Arthur Pendleton to consecutive life terms, delivering a finality that the town of Cypress Bend had spent a generation searching for. As the bailiffs led the convict away through the rear doors of the courtroom, a chapter of dark history was closed, and the heavy, oppressive shadow that had hung over the coastal community for 35 years was finally, beautifully lifted. On his final evening in Cypress Bend, Before returning to the quiet, unstructured life of his retirement, David Miller walked down to the small, coastal cemetery where Clara Vance had been laid to rest so long ago. The air was warm, smelling of salt and blooming jasmine, the sky painted in brilliant shades of orange and purple as the sun dipped below the distant horizon of the wetlands. He walked through the rows of white headstones until he reached Clara's grave, finding it adorned with fresh flowers left by the local residents who had never forgotten the tragedy that had redefined their town. Miller stood there for a long time, the cool ocean breeze rustling his hair, feeling a profound, physical sense of closure that he had never thought he would experience in his lifetime. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the duplicate copy of the 1991 case file that had lived in his garage for years, and placed a single, red police detective's badge on the cold stone, a silent tribute to a promise kept and a duty fulfilled. The silence of the cemetery was no longer heavy with the unanswered questions of a cold case, but peaceful, filled with the soft rustle of palm fronds and the distant, rhythmic wash of the waves against the shore. Clara Vance was finally at rest, her killer was in a cell, and the retired detective could finally step out of the shadows of the past and into the quiet, welcoming light of his own future.